Let's go. Let's sit.
What do you want to say?
Want me to hear? Oh yeah.
No, bro, honestly, like, I was not getting arrested.
Yeah. You're just worried about getting a ticket.
Yeah, because the people running up.
You used to be a lot lower just a year ago.
I know, but like, people are doing that. They're starting to get shit.
Yo, I had that. You know the intersection?
Yeah.
Okay, look it up. See if
There's no camera.
oh, if there's no camera, you're fine.
Yeah, what do you do?
You would have taken a picture.
No, sorry, man.
You would have taken a picture of the cop.
Yeah.
No, he didn't. I know for a fact.
I guess I'm good.
You don't like effort it with it. I don't think what that camera's on.
They do, listen, you know that on my map, right?
They have the camera on there.
No, this is what all the cameras are.
Oh, yeah, they actually. Yeah, it's so convenient.
No, I installed it.
Oh.
Because
That's convenient still.
so like the one I did it on, right? There's no camera there. I'm probably taking pictures. Because well, I need eye contact.
I've never heard of a cop taking a picture.
Well, it's because listen, like,
Before he had a chance to take
I know, but here's the thing, I was being asked like, I don't know, like, but listen, if I was doing it, I was doing it on purpose, and I was being sick. That's what's kind of scary.
take it, not the.
If I was a cop, right, and somebody got in front of me and made eye contact with me, I would definitely take those.
First of all, I don't work at fast food restaurants.
Okay, if it was messy, that's even better. Because like, then there was more stuff to do.
No, but you did eye contact, but don't say it.
Like the 10th person to do that on the day.
I pressed X to that front of a cop. It's just like, no one is as dumb as me. Here's the thing, I'm like the best driver, like in normal circumstances, right? When there's a cop,
Oh,
I'm the
then
more
it all. We all. I didn't stop at that. You don't know when you turn. You're supposed to stay in your first line. If you make a right turn, you're supposed to go to the right and the opposite way. So I'm lazy. If I know I'm going to turn left, I just turn straight to the left and left. So I did that, and then as soon as I did that, I saw a cop right in my rearview mirror. I was like, shit, they just started panicking. But yeah, they don't care. I had my license for like a year and a bit.
G2 or your G?
G2. And I didn't see the license.
Thanks for answering my question.
Why is it turning on this PowerPoint?
Anyways, where's the seat that you said you'd say here last week? But you texted me 3 minutes ago.
No, I didn't. I texted you 4 or 5 minutes ago.
Even better.
You know, I heard this one location.
I saved your
I didn't pay any tax.
so you can have a nice view of my son.
Do you like 309?
For me, like,
Yo, I actually wanted to go so bad.
I want to, but actually no, I don't want to. I like it.
What's your life?
so, and like,
Political.
State planning and markets, basically political economy.
Yeah, but like he's no, but he literally started off at like the Protestant Reformation and went like a full, and then to modern capitalism.
There's no structure to his lecture.
There's none at all. Like you just gotta type and type
You
and
guys talk
type.
about capitalism. You
Yeah.
should take a history class. Those are skinny studies.
True. I just want this class to end at 6:30 so we can be fun.
I know it's I'm just gonna
No, I can't do that. Live through this twice. Oh.
I can't do
Before we begin today's lecture, let me briefly see if there's any quick questions or comments.
Is this
about anything
3:27?
covered thus far in the class? Before I go on to looking at other material. If not, then I'd like to pick up where we left off last class, which was that we finished talking a bit about the nature of the international system and how it's changing and how that influences the nature of foreign policy by various players within the international system. And of course, one of the most notable components of the international system is U.S. dominance within it. And consequently, we're going to start our case studies of the making of foreign policy and do the most extensive investigation with regard to foreign policy of the United States, which will take up the majority of the remainder of this term, and hopefully by the end, most of your questions about American foreign policy will be answered. One reason for doing so is, as I mentioned, the centrality of the United States and the importance, therefore, of understanding how the United States makes its foreign policy. The other reason for spending a fair amount of time on the United States is because of the complexity of the foreign policy apparatus of the United States, which arguably is far more complex than most of the other case studies that we're going to be looking at. Before I begin talking explicitly about the United States in this regard, I should point out, however, that over the last week or so, there have been a couple of rather important developments that relate very closely to American foreign policy and to the various things that we've talked about in this class thus far. Among them is, on the one hand, we mentioned briefly last week, the attack on the Saudi installations by supposedly Iran. And we're, of course, not looking at either Iran or Saudi Arabia in terms of their foreign policies, but it has had an enormous impact on international relations in a number of different ways. One of which is, of course, that the Trump administration came into office promising to back out of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA deal that was reached under the Obama administration. And has proclaimed on a number of occasions that it sees Iran as the center of instability and aggression within the Middle East, as the biggest threat to peace in the Middle East. Many words that tend to give the impression that Donald Trump is itching for war with Iran. Now, we of course never know exactly what Donald Trump is up to, insofar as that threatening war seems to be part of his negotiation strategy and his way of getting others to back down. In that sense, he promised fire and fury to North Korea, only to back away from that and ultimately start various negotiations, which have not gone so very far thus far. But nonetheless, the attack on the Saudi installations, which Saudi Arabia immediately blamed on Iran, although the Houthis claimed responsibility for it, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. The United States has so far backed that, and in the meantime, so has Germany and Great Britain, I believe. Should we take that at face value? Probably not. Most of you are too young to remember the lead up to the Iraq War, but there were all sorts of things said with absolute certainty about weapons of mass destruction and ties to Al-Qaeda that turned out to be complete bullshit, pardon the vulgarity. And in that regard, even the Germans and the British are not above reading intelligence selectively and calculating their position not on the basis of the facts, but on the basis of their interests. And their interests tend to lie more closely with in their relationship to the United States than their relationship to Iran. And in that regard, are likely to back up the American claim or the Saudi claim. What's interesting about it, however, is that if the Iranians were indeed responsible for this attack, it is without a doubt an act of war, and would call for some kind of retaliation. And it's somewhat interesting that Saudi Arabia hasn't taken that step thus far, and that the United States hasn't taken that step thus far.
And we should think a little bit about why that is the case. And I would suggest that the reason for that is twofold. One is that the intelligence isn't that clear that Iran is responsible. It is entirely possible that Iranian proxies, either in Iraq or the Houthis themselves, or their proxies, launched the attack, not necessarily from Yemeni soil, but from Iraq or from elsewhere in the Middle East. And in that sense, an embarrassment of a revelation that Iran turned out not to be responsible may be one of the reasons why they're hesitating. I suspect, however, that the main reason that they're hesitating is that the attack demonstrated a fundamental change in the nature of international warfare. And the reason for that, which was nicely illustrated or nicely presented by the British journalist Patrick Coburn, is that the materials that were used in attacking the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, which were proudly displayed by the Saudi government and seem to indicate that most of the parts were manufactured in Iran or had their origins in some way, shape, or form related to Iran. He estimated cost probably somewhere in the neighborhood of a few $100,000. And if you think about that for a moment, a few $100,000 worth of weapons took out half of the oil capacities of the Saudi state. Now, Saudi Arabia, if it's guarding anything in its infrastructure, is guarding its oil installations above all else. Saudi Arabia has a defense budget of $67 billion per year. It's the third largest military spender on the planet, way ahead of Iran. Nonetheless, a few $100,000 of relatively primitive drones and cruise missiles were able to overcome those defenses, costing many billions of dollars. That in and of itself would be relatively shocking. But we also know, of course, that the United States has been focused like a laser on the Straits of Hormuz and on protecting its allies in the region. The United States has a military budget of $700 billion and extensive radar capacities and so on and so forth. And yet all of that military spending was useless in confronting these rather primitive and rather simple weapons that are relatively easily available to just about any player in the international system. And what that demonstrates is that the costs of acting against Iran have suddenly skyrocketed. The idea that the United States can issue shock and awe over Iran the way that it did over Iraq in 2003 and not pay a steep cost for it, either in terms of its allies paying that steep cost or itself paying a steep cost for it, simply is no longer the case. And in that regard, it has rather drastically changed the environment in which these kinds of decisions are made. And that may be the reason why Donald Trump and why the United States are hesitating, and indeed why Saudi Arabia is to a significant extent hesitating to take any actions against Iran. The other issue that, of course, is very important in understanding American foreign policy, and that is no doubt on your minds, is that the current occupant of the White House, the current commander-in-chief of the United States, is under investigation related to a possible impeachment. In this case, once again, the impeachment proceedings are related not to domestic matters, but to foreign policy matters. The basic accusation, for those of you not that familiar with the situation, although I doubt that many of you fall into that category, is that Donald Trump, in a phone call to the president of Ukraine, after having canceled almost $400 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine the day before, essentially said, we've been really good to you, and I wouldn't say that this has been reciprocal, and essentially, in so many words, put pressure on the president of the Ukraine to do us a favor, do the United States a favor, and the favor that he outlined is that they investigate Joe Biden and his son who has business interests in Ukraine for possible corruption and wrongdoing. The obvious implication is that he is recruiting a foreign agent, essentially to dig up dirt on his political opponent. And that certainly smells pretty stinky to most people that are concerned about fair practice in politics and in elections. So it's worth saying a couple of things about that. One of which is that the launching of impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump on the part of Democrats is an enormous risk. And one of the reasons why Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, has been so slow after numerous insistences that she launch a investigation for impeachment after the Russiagate scandal, and then after the emoluments scandal about his using his hotels to enrich himself by encouraging foreign leaders to stay in his hotels and so on and so forth, all of which basically fizzled out and did not lead to impeachment procedures. She has now agreed to these impeachment procedures. We probably don't know all the facts on the table about this, but it is a risky proposition for a couple of reasons. One of which is that it is most likely to fail. The Democrats currently have a majority in the House of Representatives, and the Democrats obviously hate Donald Trump and are willing to accuse him of all sorts of things, whether real or imagined. And much of the Russiagate investigation, I unfortunately think was largely imagined. The basic claim with regard to Russiagate investigations was that Donald Trump encouraged his buddy Putin to investigate Hillary Clinton, that Russia consequently got hold of her emails and released them just before the elections, which sank Hillary Clinton's chance of becoming elected as president. What doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense out of that is that these emails were, of course, published through WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks leader, Julian Assange, has repeatedly stated that they did not come from a state agent, that they came from from another source, and the suggestion there is that they probably came from a disgruntled Democrat, a supporter of Bernie Sanders, who resented the treatment of Bernie Sanders in the 2016 elections and the extent to which the cards were stacked against them by the Democratic National Committee and by association by Hillary Clinton. Is this another example of smoke and mirrors? That's hard to say. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight in regard to this is the basic risks to the Democrats. The first of which is that it will fail. And the reason why it may well fail is that the Democrats control more than half of the House of Representatives. In order to launch impeachment, they have to have 50% of the votes in the House of Representatives to initiate the investigation, and ultimately, if the investigation uncovers wrongdoing, to recommend an impeachment, in which case it goes to a trial in the Senate. And in the Senate, in order to get a conviction, you require 2/3 majority of all senators to vote to convict him of high crimes and misdemeanors and impeach him. The Senate, however, is under a narrow Republican majority, and consequently getting 2/3 of the Republicans to vote to impeach Donald Trump is an uphill battle. I'm not saying it's impossible. One thing that I think we should remember is that up until 3 years ago, almost every Republican hated Donald Trump's guts and did whatever they could to prevent him from becoming the candidate. So in that sense, that they've suddenly become converts to Trumpism is doubtful. But they're probably keeping their mouths shut about things to make sure that they don't incur the enmity of Donald Trump and waiting their time to advance their interests further. So it's quite possible that some of those Republicans, that some of that Republican support will melt away, and the Senate may indeed impeach. I think it's rather unlikely. Yeah.
Would it even be worth, like, for the Democrats to impeach Trump now, because like the process takes such a long time, and like general election is only like 13 or 14 months away? So wouldn't it just be a good idea to, have that shadow of the doubt?
I think Nancy Pelosi's position was precisely that. Is that it would be better for the Democrats if he's voted out of office than if he's impeached. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of which is that if he's impeached, all of the Republicans will blame the foul play of the Democrats for impeaching their president and will worsen the partisan tensions within the United States. So in that regard, it's certainly problematic. Why are they going ahead with it anyway? And to get back to the points that I was trying to make with regard to impeachment, one of the reasons I think that they're going ahead with the impeachments, regardless of the hesitancy of Nancy Pelosi and the other more conservative Democrats, is that they've been sitting on the fence for so long on this matter. And there has been a fairly strong left-wing component of the Democratic Party that has been consistently ridiculing the reluctance on the part of the more centrist leaders of the Democratic Party to actually play hardball with Donald Trump. And this latest revelation seems to have pushed them over the edge. Why is it risky even if they do succeed? Well, first of all, if it fails, it will be seen as yet another example of the witch hunt that has been conducted by Donald Trump against the Democrats, pardon me, against Donald Trump, and will infuriate the Republican base against the Democrats. And given the already tense partisan nature of American politics, that's certainly not a good thing. If it succeeds, however, you will then have President Pence. And I'm not entirely sure that very many Democrats would rather have a President Pence than a President Trump. And having a President Pence running as an incumbent in the next elections, or possibly Donald Trump running even after he's been impeached, there's nothing that would prevent him from running again afterwards, is not necessarily a desirable thing for the Republicans either. One thing to keep in mind about impeachment is, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we look at the U.S. Constitution, is that the U.S. Constitution states that a president can be impeached, can be removed from office if he is guilty of committing high crimes and misdemeanors, making him unfit for office. And the question, of course, is what do they mean by high crimes and misdemeanors? And the answer to that is that there is no real answer. In other words, that legal scholars that have looked at the Constitution and previous examples of an impeachment have all come to the conclusion that high crimes and misdemeanors means whatever 2/3 of the Senate think it means. In other words, that impeachment is not a legal procedure, it's a political procedure. And whether he is impeached or not will not so much depend on whether he broke the letter of the law in some way that qualifies as a crime or misdemeanor, but rather on whether enough senators are convinced that his actions are inimical to American institutions to push that matter through, whether he actually committed a crime or not. And in that regard, I'm not a lawyer, I'm certainly not an international lawyer, and I wouldn't want to wade into the discussions of exactly what constitutes a crime in regard to what Donald Trump has done. But it's a slippery issue. The basic idea of the impeachment charges is that he recruited a foreign government to do him favors in return for American aid. In other words, there was a kind of a quid pro quo that was insisted. We'll give you the aid, but you have to do this, that, or the other thing. One thing that should be relatively clear, and that we'll certainly explore in much more detail subsequently, is that the United States does not give aid without certain strings attached ever to any country. And indeed, most international relations experts would sort of say there's not a country on the planet that gives aid without some kind of self-interest being involved in it. In other words, what we have to do is to distinguish between the aid that is given by every president that has various strings attached to it, such as you make sure that you behave, that you toe the party line in other international conflicts and side with us on it, and so on and so forth, or that you open your markets up to our investments and all those kinds of quid pro quos, which arguably are quid pro quos that are in the interest of the United States as a whole and not of a partisan nature. The only way to convict Donald Trump is to suggest that this was not a quid pro quo that benefited the United States as a whole, but rather one that undermined American democracy. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily that easy of a case to make. And in that sense, I think they're on somewhat slippery ground. But we will keep our eyes on the proceedings as we move forward. As this gentleman suggested, the elections are coming up pretty quickly, and consequently, the Democrats in particular are certainly not going to be keen on having this take a long time and spill over into 2020 and suck all of the oxygen out of the air in terms of the elections, so that every focus will be on the impeachment and not on the numerous policy issues and so on and so forth that Democrats really want to focus on in the elections. Let's leave the impeachment at that and focus our attention now on U.S. foreign policy and the making of it. And in that regard, one of the first things that I'd like to point out in studying American foreign policy is that studying American foreign policy is of enormous interest for a number of reasons, one of which is that in many ways, studying American foreign policy allows us a more detailed view of the making of foreign policy than is the case in many other countries, for the simple reason that the basic institutions through which American foreign policy are made have been in existence for well over, or for almost 250 years, and have evolved during that period. In sharp contrast to almost every other country that we're going to be looking at, that has gone through rather radical changes during those periods, and whose political system is nowhere near as long-lived as that of the United States. It's also unique insofar as the institutions that govern the United States, including its foreign policy apparatus, were created in radically different circumstances than the circumstances under which those identical institutions function today. In other words, the United States Constitution was established in 1789, a time at which the United States consisted of 13 colonies. All 13 colonies were overwhelmingly agricultural in nature, and were in a relatively insignificant portion of the planet. Perhaps one of the reasons why the British did not use every last resource available to them to battle against the independence of the United States, as other colonies such as India and so on were probably much more important to them in economic terms than those 13 colonies in the United States. In other words, the same institutions govern a relatively primitive and agrarian collection of ex-colonies and evolved through a period when the United States established itself as a continental power, ultimately as a hemispheric hegemon, became one of the industrial powerhouses of the planet, became one of the superpowers during the 20th century, and ultimately became a unipolar dominant power globally, and arguably a global hegemon, all under the same basic institutions that were created in 1789. So a good starting point in terms of looking at the United States foreign policy is to look at that basic document, the Constitution, how it came into existence, and how it spelled out the procedures for making foreign policy. It helps in that regard. First of all, to consider a couple of things about the circumstances that gave rise to the Constitution. And those circumstances are, of course, the American Revolution and its relationship with Great Britain. The United States, in this context, was a product of colonialism. And colonialism, to make a very long story very short, was most concisely defined by the political scientist and historian Emanuel Wallerstein, who recently passed away, and who was the founder of world systems theory, who argued that colonialism was essentially the search of European powers for regions of the planet weak enough to conquer and rich enough to exploit. Weak enough to conquer and rich enough to exploit. And that search on the part of European powers began with merchants looking for wealth through trade with more exotic places, trade in silk and spices and various other goods that were in short supply in Europe. But the societies that they encountered that were certainly wealthy enough and rich enough to exploit were not easy to conquer for Europeans. China, India, the countries of the Far East had highly developed societies of their own, arguably societies that were more highly developed than their European counterparts, certainly when looking at China and India. consequently, these were drawn into the colonial system somewhat later and by different means. The Spanish, in that search for regions rich enough to exploit and weak enough to conquer, hit the jackpot. In essence, when one of their merchants, Columbus, tried to take a shortcut and stumbled into the Western Hemisphere. And there encountered societies that were indeed enormously wealthy and worth exploiting, and were weak enough to conquer. Why were they weak enough to conquer? Anyone? No?
I mean, they didn't have the weaponry as the, and their
That's a
immune
fairly
system.
common answer given, is that the European weaponry was superior.
And
The
also-
European weaponry might well have been superior.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Germs is, I think, the most important component. Essentially, Diamond, in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, argues that the biggest advantage that the Europeans had over their Western Hemisphere counterparts is that they were dirtier. Something that certainly Europeans don't like to think of themselves as. But the reality is that European cities were filthy in the Middle Ages. Essentially, since the Roman Empire, which did develop things like sewage systems and so on and so forth, those things were abandoned in the Middle Ages in the United States, pardon me, in Europe. And consequently meant that cities which were supplied by ox carts and horses had no sewage system whatsoever. The human waste was simply dumped out the window into the streets, and walking around the European streets in the Middle Ages, and we were literally walking knee deep in shit. As you can imagine, that's not a very hygienic environment to grow up in. Demographers came to the conclusion that European society or cities would have disappeared altogether as a result of these unhygienic conditions if it hadn't been for constant influx of people from the countryside, in which people were reproducing more quickly than they could be made use of in the agrarian system. Suffice it to say that Europeans, as a result of that experience over a number of centuries, developed resistance to a number of diseases that simply didn't exist in the Western Hemisphere. One reason for that was also the nature of draft animals in Western Europe. Western Europeans used extensive numbers of draft animals like pigs, horses, cows, chickens, and so on and so forth that passed diseases to humans, but that were absent in the Western Hemisphere. And consequently, as Charles Mann in his book 1492 argues, the population of the Western Hemisphere dropped by 90% within a decade of the first contact with Europeans. And that meant that many, the vast majority of those that died of European-introduced diseases never saw a European. The diseases simply spread much more quickly than European explorers did. The Spanish, by the time that they got to places like the Incas, found the remnants of a highly sophisticated society that had simply fallen apart. With 90% of the population disappearing, those kinds of systems simply couldn't be maintained, and essentially all they had to do was mop up the mess that was left behind. And of course, the Spanish were first and foremost interested in collecting gold and silver. But after the gold and silver had been removed from those regions of the Western Hemisphere that had it, began to try to integrate those regions into their economy as suppliers of goods that were in high demand in Western Europe. The possessions that the Spanish had, that predominantly meant things like rubber, coffee, and so on. North America, in this regard, was somewhat less interesting. It was less interesting to the Spanish, A, because there wasn't much gold there, so they weren't particularly interested in looking in North America. And B, because its climate resembled that of Western Europe, and consequently the agricultural goods that could be produced there were not of as much interest to them. Meaning that the later arrivals in that competition, France and Britain, made the main effort to colonize North America, and did so in a slightly different pattern. I don't want to repeat the entire history of colonization in North America. Most of you have gotten that in your history classes, since the Canadian history in that regard is not that different. Suffice it to say that in the United States itself, two patterns prevailed. One was the pattern that began around the first settlement in North America, that of Jamestown, in what is now Virginia, which was the result of a commercial venture looking initially for gold and silver, but then noticing the enormous amounts of natural resources available in the region around Virginia. And consequently, after getting the first thing that the Europeans were that the British in particular were very interested in, wood, out of the way, started to carve up the territory into large-scale plantations for the production of goods that couldn't be readily produced in Europe, most notably sugar, tobacco, and cotton. And that gave rise to the southern economy that was dominated by these industries throughout the colonial period and through the first portion of American history. The northern regions were settled not so much by wealthy entrepreneurs that brought their indentured servants as well as slaves to work their plantations, but rather were settled initially by those escaping religious persecution, in England in particular. In England, England had undergone the Reformation, slipped out under the dominance of the Catholic Church, and established the Anglican Church as the equivalent of the Catholic Church to dominate England. But the fact that they were able to question the teachings of the Catholic Church opened up a window to all sorts of other religious groups to read the Bible themselves directly and come to their own conclusions, many of which were much more radical, the Puritans in particular being sort of what we would call fundamentalists today, and the British didn't like it, or in any event the Anglican Church didn't like them, and consequently tried to suppress them as much as possible. And it's in that context that the Mayflower sailed from Great Britain under the leadership of John Winthrop, and John Winthrop promised that he would create a society in this empty country that he was expecting to arrive in, based on pure biblical teachings, and based on simple agriculture and so on. In other words, the northern regions, aside from their wood and some limited resources, were not as interesting economically to Great Britain, and also developed in a very different pattern, something that will become important in American history subsequently. I don't want to talk too much about that, but one of the things that I did want to point out as a starting point for understanding the U.S. Constitution is the nature of the American Revolution. The American Revolution, it should first and foremost be pointed out, should really not be considered a revolution. If by revolution we mean what is generally understood as a revolution, in which a dominant elite is replaced by lower classes and a new dominant elite comes to power, representing a new set of interests and new class of individuals. In that sense, the Russian Revolution was without a doubt a revolution. It replaced the dominant elite and largely liquidated the old feudal order. The French Revolution was, in that regard, a true revolution, although somewhat of an incomplete one, insofar as that it resulted in the restoration of the monarchy a couple of times in the 19th century and left many remnants of the old order in place. The United States rebelled against Britain, not because the lower classes rose up against the British that were exploiting them, but rather because the elites within Britain, within American society resented the extent of control that the British had over them, and in particular their ability to impose taxes on the wealthy within the United States, and to restrict their trade, and to restrict their ability to capture more territory further west. In other words, to expand their wealth. The upshot of that is that the revolution was really a rebellion against British rule, not a revolution. And rebellion against British rule, that contrary to the perceptions of many Americans currently, was not a rejection of colonialism. It was a rejection of the American colonial status within the British Empire, but certainly not a rejection of colonialism. And that was made evident by the fact that the American elites very quickly carried on the colonial process by spreading their control westward and essentially colonizing the rest of North America. It was not a rejection of colonialism, but a rejection of their subservient position within that colonial enterprise, and the extent to which the British were siphoning off the lion's share of the profits from that enterprise. The upshot of that is that those that were very wealthy within the 13 colonies of the United States, with some notable exceptions, remained very wealthy in the United States after it gained its independence. The notable exceptions in that regard are those that, to a large extent, ended up in this corner of Canada. The Loyalists that refused to back the revolutionaries and stuck with the crown, and consequently felt that they were no longer safe once the revolutionaries won, and withdrew themselves into Upper Canada, largely around these areas. And it's easy to understand how that kind of dynamic played out. Basically, when the Revolutionary War started, everyone within the American society had to decide basically who was going to end up being most likely to win. And betting against the British in 1776 was a pretty risky proposition. They were by far the most powerful country in the world, had the largest navy, had the largest standing army, and consequently, even if you didn't like the British, you were probably going to be reluctant to try to oppose them. And in that sense, certainly large numbers stayed loyal to the British, and at the end of the war, when the revolutionaries won, were seen as traitors and consequently removed themselves from that territory. Suffice it to say, however, that the basic class nature of American society, a very small, landed and wealthy elite, in control of most of the economic levers in the United States, and the rest of the population consisting largely of indentured servants in the north that were indentured as a result of having to pay off the cost of their trip across the Atlantic in order to become independent, and of course of slaves in the South. That basic reality continued. Now, most of you that are somewhat familiar with American history, and by the way, let me just ask, how many of you have taken a course in American government? A handful, okay, so I'm going to try to not bore you to tears by going over all of that. But since it's only a handful of you, I don't want to leave everyone else behind that isn't that familiar with American government, so please tolerate my brief review of some of the basics of American government and the system of separation of powers and so on and so forth in moving forward. The American Revolution, after its success, produced a first constitution, which ultimately failed. So the current constitution is the second constitution that governed the United States. The first was referred to as the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation created a very weak central government whose sole responsibility essentially was to deal with foreign affairs, but left almost all other governing powers in the hands of the 13 separate colonies, or 13 separate states at this point. And these 13 separate states created their own constitutions for governing their own affairs, some of which were very democratic, and some of which were highly restrictive, requiring extensive property in order to participate in elections and things along those lines. In other words, there was considerable difference between the states in terms of their governing institutions. The reason why the Articles of Confederation failed are complex to a certain extent, and I don't want to spend too much time on them. Suffice it to say that the new Constitution, the current Constitution, was a result of a crisis that emerged out of the Articles of Confederation. And that crisis took two different forms. One related to a large extent to domestic matters. In particular, the fact that when the revolutionary forces that ousted the British from North America began their enterprise, they of course had no money. They had to recruit various people to fight within that military, and consequently, large numbers of those that fought against the British did so on the basis of taking out credits, on the assumption that once they were victorious, these credits would be forgiven and they would reap significant rewards. But once the British were defeated, the banks that provided these loans nonetheless wanted those loans repaid. And that created an enormous amount of tension in a number of different states, in particular because the creditors, the banks, represented a fairly small, very wealthy component of American society, and the debtors represented the vast majority. And that meant that increasingly there was pressure within the states to alleviate this problem. That took the form of democratic measures in some of the more democratic states. New Jersey was among them, had one of the more open constitutions, and took more violent forms in other states, such as Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, debtors, primarily farmers, formed a militia that marched on the Capitol in 1787, I believe it was, in what became known as Shays' Rebellion. And launched an attack on the armory in Springfield to capture the arms of the state of Massachusetts in order to overthrow the government. And essentially, the attempt on the one hand by New Jersey to undermine the property of the wealthy in the form of forgiving their credits, and on the other hand, the violent attempts to overthrow the creditor groups in Massachusetts sent alarm bells through the elites within I would say, in the 13 colonies of the United States, arguing that began to argue that they needed a stronger federal government to restrain these kinds of radical impulses in the states and to maintain stability, meaning a stable social structure in which their wealth was safe. That required a stronger federal government to restrain the actions of states. The second crisis emerged from the relationship between the United States and in particular Great Britain. Essentially, as I pointed out, the Articles of Confederation were meant primarily to deal with the external relations of the United States with other countries. Britain, which certainly did not like the new government in the United States and was very keen on recapturing control over its lost colonies, in part because the success of the American Revolution was an example to other colonies that they might also be able to rid themselves of British rule and so on, something that the British certainly weren't keen to tolerate. Suffice it to say that the British started to argue in the mid-1780s that it was useless to carry on any kind of negotiations with the government of the United States as a whole, since they could not enforce the decisions that they made and the deals that they made with the British in the states themselves, that would maintain too much autonomy. And consequently, the British started to negotiate with the state governments directly, bypassing the central government. The justification was that the central government was too weak to actually enforce its bargains, but hidden behind that was certainly an attempt by the British to try to divide the colonies against each other in order ultimately to regain dominance over them. And that in turn reinforced the idea that the Articles of Confederation were insufficient and required a stronger government, a stronger central government. The emphasis here is on confederation. A confederation is a different kind of a system from a federalist system. In a federalist system like Canada, sovereignty unambiguously resides in Ottawa. The separate provinces certainly have their own powers and their own independence over certain matters. But there's absolutely no question in the system in Canada as to where sovereignty resides. Of course, Quebec has tried to play with that, and it's uncertain exactly how that would come to a head if Quebec actually did vote to try to get out of Canada. But so far, that has not happened, and there is no real ambiguity about that. And there certainly is no ambiguity in the United States today about where sovereignty resides. But in the Articles of Confederation, a confederation is a system not like a federalist system, but one in which a number of independent states pool their resources in various ways in order to cooperatively govern themselves. In that sense, the European Union currently is a kind of confederal system in that it has a central government in Brussels, but sovereignty still unambiguously resides in the separate individual states. That may change over time, but the European Union is still a long way away from that. It has pooled most of its governing functions in economic terms, but each of the countries in the European Union, as we'll discover next term, still maintain their own separate foreign policies, still maintain their own separate military institutions, and so on and so forth. In that sense, sovereignty still resides in Berlin or Paris or the various other capitals in Europe. The basic insistence on the part of the elites that joined in a constitutional convention in 1789 was to move from a confederation to a federalist system. Federalist system. Now let me actually talk about the Constitution a little bit. The first thing that I should say about the Constitution is that the perceptions of the Constitution, especially among Americans and American students, is sometimes very distorted. Americans tend to talk about the Constitution as a kind of higher law that stands above the day-to-day lawmaking that represents the unity of the entire system, and indeed every public servant in the federal government of the United States is sworn to uphold the Constitution. In that sense, it is sort of almost a quasi-religious kind of a document. And the impression is that this document was crafted by a group of wise individuals, referred to as the Founding Fathers, that sat down together to form a perfect kind of a government and came up with this Constitution. Thus, the reference to the Founding Fathers rather than to the framers of the Constitution. And this attitude can be nicely illustrated in a number of different ways. One of which is that one of the Supreme Court judges that was brought in front of the Senate for approval after her appointment, Eleanor Kagan, was asked in the Senate, especially as she was appointed by Bill Clinton, and consequently Republicans were rather hostile to her. And she was asked about the Constitution and her attitude toward it, and in her answer about her attitude to the Constitution, she quoted her mentor, who was Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court judge on the U.S. Supreme Court, who argued that the U.S. Constitution was a flawed document. And the second that she quoted that, it wasn't her own phrase, it was a phrase that she adopted from a Supreme Court judge himself, the Republicans went apeshit. How can you possibly become a defender of the Constitution as a Supreme Court judge if you consider the Constitution a flawed document? That's outrageous. Was the Constitution a flawed document? Well, pretty much anyone that thinks critically about it for a second would have to say that it was a deeply flawed document. A deeply flawed document, and I won't talk about all of the flaws at the moment, first and foremost by virtue of the fact that it accepted the institution of slavery. Something that is certainly contrary to most principles of democracy and liberalism and so on. Secondly, in that it excluded the 50% of the population that was of the wrong gender from any kind of participation. So in that sense, certainly from our modern perspective and from the perspective of how we expect democracies to function today, the Constitution was certainly a flawed document when it emerged from the Constitutional Convention in 1789. Another very good illustration of this basic dynamic was about a decade ago. John McCain was running for president, and he was searching for a vice presidential candidate that would bolster his chances of election, and announced that he was going to select the governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin, as his running mate. At the time, virtually nobody had heard of Sarah Palin. Alaska is not a state that is of high concern to most Americans. And consequently, the first thing that she had to do was she had to go on all the talk shows to introduce herself to Americans and demonstrate what a great candidate she was. And consequently went on, I think it was the Barbara Walters show, and Barbara Walters, as the first question said, listen, I think one of the reasons that you were selected by John McCain is that you were one of the most prominent leaders of what became known as the Tea Party movement in the Republican Party. And the Tea Party movement is a movement that takes its name from the Tea Party, the folks that dumped the British tea into Boston Harbor. That was the opening phase of the American Revolution. And she said, that seems to illustrate that you have an enormous respect for the founding fathers of the U.S. Constitution and for the Constitution itself. So, just as a out of interest, which of the framers of the Constitution was your favorite? And for a second, she looked like a deer caught in the headlight, and then she said, sort of standing, and said, all of them. Now, that might not seem particularly funny to you. It should, because it's an absurd comment. It basically means that she had no idea, that she'd never read anything about the Constitution, that she had no idea what went on in trying to create the Constitution, and looked at it the way that most American children are taught to look at it, as a kind of a unifying document created by these bunch of wise men that all were in agreement about it. And nothing could be further from the truth. The U.S. Constitution is above all else a result of politics. It's a result of politics. It's a result of conflict and compromise between the various players within that constitutional convention. And it should be pointed out that the various players within that constitutional convention were not representative of the United States. All of them were extremely wealthy. I think without exception, all of them owned slaves. And in that sense represented the elites in American society at the time, not the general public. But given that, and given that they should have been relatively unified in their interests as the ruling elites, they nonetheless had deeply different understandings of what they wanted to achieve in that constitutional convention. And the Constitution itself is a result of how that conflict played out. The best way to demonstrate that is that the Constitutional Convention boiled down very quickly to two different proposals for the Constitution. The first was known as the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan. And the second was called the Virginia Plan. The delegation from New Jersey suggested a plan for a constitution to create a strong government with a strong legislature, and in that legislature, all states would be equally represented. That proposition was unacceptable to a large number of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, in particular the delegation from Virginia. The reason being that Virginia was one of the largest states in terms of its population at the time, and the idea that all states would be represented equally, which might be okay for a relatively small state like New Jersey, or for Maryland, or Delaware, or Rhode Island, would vastly underrepresent the citizens of large states like Virginia, or New York, or Georgia. And consequently, they came up with a plan of having representation in the legislature based on population. Having representation based on population, in turn, was unacceptable to the smaller states, whose power would almost be eliminated in a legislature in which the larger states were able to dominate. And consequently, what emerged out of that was a compromise, known as the Connecticut Compromise. Because it was produced by the delegation from Connecticut, that ultimately became the Constitution. And you'll note, if you're familiar with American institutions, that the actual Constitution took a portion of the New Jersey Plan and a portion of the Virginia Plan and melded them together. In essence, with regard to the legislature, it created a bicameral legislature. Congress is a bicameral legislative body with one house, the House of Representatives, based on representation by population. In other words, the entire country is divided up into equal voting districts, equal in terms of population, And each voting district elects one representative for a 2-year period. The second house, which is often considered the upper house in the Congress, although they are co-equal branches, consists of 2 representatives from each state. Representatives from each state. In other words, equal representation on the part of the states. In that regard, we can see that the Constitution is the result of conflict between different interests and compromise between them. But that conflict and compromise did not end there. Another major conflict that had to be overcome in order to establish a constitution related to the nature of slaves. As I pointed out, the Constitution did not reject the institution of slavery, although it was already controversial at the time of its passage. But the fact that it did not reject slavery opened a can of worms that was also rather difficult. In essence, the northern states said, okay, well, we have to accept slavery, and we have to accept slavery. There's not much we can do about that. But slaves are not citizens, and therefore they cannot vote, and therefore they cannot be counted as part of the population. And the southern states, a large portion of their population being slaves, said, well, that's no good. That means that we'll be badly underrepresented. Slaves should be counted, but of course it should have a vote. And as you can understand, the northern population, in which slaves were much lower in number, found that unacceptable because that would vastly inflate the votes of the white population of the southern states over their counterparts in the north. Consequently, that issue likewise was settled through a compromise. And anyone know what that compromise was?
They were represented as 3/5 of a person.
Yeah, no, that's not quite correct. They were counted as 3/5 of a person, not represented as 3/5 of a person. In other words, the populations of the southern states would count every slave as 2/3 or 3/5 of a person, but of course those slaves wouldn't have a vote. And again, in that sense, a kind of a compromise was reached. The Constitution is without a question a political document. And one of the things that should also be noted is that at the time of the Constitutional Convention, there were no political parties. And indeed, the framers of the American Constitution considered political parties essentially an evil kind of institution, a highly problematic institution. They consequently designed the Constitution in such a way as to make it relatively difficult for parties to establish themselves. The U.S. Constitution, unlike its parliamentary counterpart, is based on regional representation. The role of representatives in Congress is not to represent their party, it's to represent their constituents. And insofar as the constituents of one, or the population of one constituency has different interests from another, party unity becomes virtually impossible. The representatives in the House of Representatives and the Senate represent radically different populations in their home states, and that means that partisan votes in Congress are very, very rare. We'll get back to that topic in a little bit more detail later on. Beyond that, and one of the ways of understanding the reluctance about political parties is in trying to kind of understand the Constitution and to not spend too much time on it. One of the best ways to understand it, one that I learned from the professor that was my mentor at this university when I was doing my PhD, Gene Edward Smith, who used to teach the course on American government, in which I was a TA, used to start his lecture on the American Constitution with the statement that the American Constitution is fundamentally about 3 things. It's fundamentally about the distrust of majorities, the distrust of majorities, and the distrust of majorities. Or to put it differently, the distrust of democracy, the distrust of democracy, and the distrust of democracy. In other words, the framers of the American Constitution were not inclined to empower a majority to implement its preferred policies. They were, above all else, focused on the protection of minorities, the protection of minorities. And indeed, this is already somewhat implicit in the Declaration of Independence. That was the rallying cry of the American revolutionaries. The opening statement of the American Declaration of Independence, paraphrased because it's not completely memorized, is, "We consider these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that it is the role of government to protect those rights, and that any government that violates those rights becomes illegitimate as a result of doing so, and that it is the right and the duty of its citizens to alter or abolish it." In other words, the measure of legitimacy of governments, as implied by the Declaration of Independence, isn't that they reflect the will of the majority, but rather that they respect the rights of the minority. Now, that emphasis on minority rights is understandable in the context of the American society as it existed at the time, in that, as you probably are aware, large portions of the population of the United States were individuals that escaped from Western Europe because they were oppressed minorities, in particular religious minorities. The Puritans I already mentioned as one such group. The Quakers that settled to a significant extent in Pennsylvania and places like that were another such a minority. And Quakers in particular were a minority that was rather fearful of the situation that arose at the end of the Revolutionary War for a very simple reason. What do you know about Quakers? Anyone know anything about Quakers? They're pacifists. Okay. So what did they do during the Revolutionary War? Nothing. And if you did nothing, well, the Revolutionary War, or those that fought in the Revolutionary War, were somewhat like George W. Bush when he stated, "You're either with us or you're with the terrorists." In other words, there was no neutral ground between Britain and the United States in that context. And for them to sit on the sidelines, for many of those that were revolutionaries, was essentially to accede to British rule and made them essentially traitors. And consequently, it's understandable that they would be rather fearful of majority revenge against their reaping the benefits of independence without having paid a price for it. So in that sense, certainly, the emphasis on minorities is a pretty understandable one. But as Charles Beard, in his seminal book, The Economic Reading of the Constitution, I think argues convincingly, there's one minority that the framers of the American Constitution were above all else interested in protecting. And I think you can probably guess what that minority was. Anyone want to guess?
The landowners?
The wealthy, the rich, the upper classes, those with property. Indeed, the Declaration of Independence stated that the purpose of government is to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, where have you heard that phrase before? Especially those that you've studied political theory. That's right. John Locke argued that the purpose of government was to protect life, liberty, and property. And the framers of the American Constitution were very close readers of John Locke. Were probably more influenced by him and to some extent Adam Smith and Montesquieu than just about anyone else. But they also recognized that using the idea of life, liberty, and property as a slogan in a revolutionary war was problematic, given that they needed the support of large numbers of people that had no property, and certainly weren't inclined in that direction. And consequently, they substituted the phrase the pursuit of happiness. Everyone can agree on the pursuit of happiness for that statement. The idea of the U.S. Constitution, therefore, was to not empower majorities to implement their preferences, but rather to protect minorities, to decentralize power as much as possible in order to prevent a tyranny of the majority that would violate either the religious rights of minorities or the property rights of other minorities. And that is the reason for the system of checks and balances, or otherwise known as the separation of powers. Separation of powers. And in discussing the separation of powers, let me delve a little bit into the Constitution itself. But before doing so, one of the things that I want to say about this often used phrase in describing the American institutions is that a more accurate description of American institutions, especially when it comes to foreign policy, is not so much the separation of powers, but of separate institutions sharing power. Separate institutions sharing power. I won't go through a detailed discussion of the domestic aspects of these separate institutions sharing power. Suffice it to give you a very brief outline of the nature of the American Constitution and the basic institutions that it created. In essence, the idea was to separate the branches of the government in accordance to their function. So that one branch of government would be the legislative branch, that legislates. But the legislative branch does not govern. The other branch would be the executive branch. The executive branch, under the control of the president, has really only one function. And that is to see that the laws passed by Congress are faithfully executed, at least in regard to domestic politics. It's a little bit more complicated than that, as we'll see. But essentially you get the idea. One branch makes the law, the other branch implements the law, or enforces the law. Now, given their concern with minorities, they consider the legislative branch, the branch that makes the law, the most dangerous branch, because it's in that branch that oppressive schemes would most likely emerge. And for that reason, they decided, or they argued, that it was best to separate that branch against itself. So you have two different sets of interests confronting each other, ambition countering ambition within the legislative branch itself. In that regard, the House of Representatives was intended to be the most democratic institution, the one that is most closely tied to the demos, in other words, the people, and had little or no autonomy from the people. What I mean by that is that, on the one hand, the voting districts were relatively small, so that the representatives from those voting districts could have a relatively close relationship with their constituents, were not simply anonymous. And secondly, that they were only elected for 2-year periods. In other words, they were permanently in election mode and could not afford, therefore, to vote against the interests of their own constituents without fearing being replaced in the next elections. They were, in that sense, relatively passive. Their role was simply to listen to their constituents and do what they want in Washington, and not to have much of a role in terms of thinking critically for themselves or enacting their own philosophical beliefs and things along those lines. The Senate, by contrast, was supposed to be rather different. First of all, the Senate was not elected. In the meantime, it is, but at the time of its creation, its members were appointed by the governments of the states, 2 from each state, for 6-year terms. And that meant essentially, since they were appointed by an elected government, they were insulated from public pressure through that process. They did not have to stand for elections directly themselves. And secondly, by virtue of the fact that they were appointed for 6-year terms, they had the luxury, to a far greater extent than their counterparts in the House of Representatives, to vote with their own conscience. In other words, to vote against the interests of their constituents, if they thought it was wise to do so. In that regard, they are the more elite chamber, intended to be a check on the will of the majority as expressed to that more democratic chamber of the House of Representatives. And because they are the more elite chamber, they also have privileges that members of the House of Representatives don't have. The House of Representatives consists of 435 individuals, and for 435 individuals to get anything done, to vote on anything, have to observe pretty strict rules. And those rules include limits on time with regard to various speeches and contributions made by individual members, and limits of time on how long a particular bill can be debated before it's voted on, and all that kind of stuff. In the Senate, there's no such rules. And the fact that there's no such rules means that there's the possibility for what has become known as the filibuster. Filibuster. Filibuster basically is the ultimate protection of a minority in that it allows any senator to get up on the floor of the Senate and start talking and refuse to remove himself from the floor of the Senate, and therefore prevent a vote from going forward. And there's no rules that indicate as to what he has to do while he's on the floor. There are examples in which a senator has simply walked up on the floor of the Senate with his mother's cookbook and started reading her recipes one after another, basically in order to waste time. And waste time in such a way as to force those that support the bill in question that they so drastically oppose to offer various kinds of amendments to get him out of the way and to allow for a vote, therefore to water the bill down, or simply to run out the clock and prevent the thing from coming up to a vote at all. And if there's no vote on it, that bill can't pass. So in that sense, the institutions of the Senate and the House of Representatives are designed, in essence, to thwart strong majority rule and to enhance the ability of small minorities to block any kind of legislation that might be inimical to their core interests. The distrust of majorities, the distrust of majorities, and the distrust of majorities. In terms of foreign policy, the Congress does have several important powers. The first is that the Congress has the power to tax and spend. Only Congress can pass taxes, and only Congress can spend money. So the purse strings are always firmly in control of the Congress, both for domestic programs as well as for foreign matters. In terms of foreign relations, the most important power provided to Congress is to raise and supply an army and navy. To raise and supply an army and navy. Again, that's part of their spending powers. Their spending powers, raising armies and navies is one of the most expensive things that governments do, and that's clearly in the control of Congress. Closely related to that is Congress that has the power to declare war. A further power mentioned in the Constitution that seems less important these days, but certainly was important at the time, was to define piracy. It is of some importance in that one of the first military involvements on the part of the United States was a conflict that the United States was involved in the early 19th century in a struggle against the Barbary pirates. The Barbary pirates were attacking various ships, including American ships in particular, entering the Mediterranean. And the Americans sent in their navy to capture Tripoli, the base of these pirate groups, in order to eliminate that threat. Not of importance, but nonetheless worth mentioning. Other than that, it is the role of Congress to regulate commerce. Between the states and between the United States and foreign entities. And lastly, to offer advice and consent to the policies of the president, something that we'll discuss in the context of the powers of the president momentarily. It is clear from that list of powers that Congress was intended to have a role in foreign affairs. But it is also equally clear that the framers of the American Constitution considered the president to be the most important actor in the shaping of American foreign policy. The executive branch, at the head of which is the president, whose powers are outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution. The first and most important power that the president enjoys in terms of his power overall, and certainly with respect to foreign affairs, is that the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Of the armed forces of the United States. Is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The importance of that is fairly evident. However, one of the things that I should point out with regard to this is that the role of the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces is something that's difficult to ignore in the current context of American politics. And the president is the most powerful office in the world, in all likelihood, in large part because the American armed forces are among the most powerful, or the most powerful on the planet. In that sense, it demonstrates an enormous power of the president and the centrality of the presidency. That was not the case at the time of the framing of the Constitution. The United States did not have a standing army, and consequently, the intention of the framers was that Congress, in this regard, was to a large extent in the driver's seat, by virtue of the fact that the president didn't have an armed force to be the commander-in-chief of unless Congress created one. And Congress created them only for specific conflicts. In other words, the United States functioned throughout most of its history on what was known as a Minuteman theory of defense. And the Minuteman theory of defense essentially held that the United States had no enemies capable of threatening its security on its borders. The only powers globally that could threaten the United States and its security, the security of its borders, were powers in Western Europe. And for those powers to threaten the United States, would require that they mobilize their forces and transport them across the Atlantic, which would easily provide the United States 3, 4 weeks, 5 weeks to prepare itself for such an onslaught, enough time to mobilize its own forces, and then to demobilize them once the conflict was over. And that meant that the United States had essentially only a corps of officers, meaning that the United States did establish officer training facilities such as West Point that trains most of the Army officials, and Annapolis that trains most of the Navy. But they only retained throughout most of their history that corps of officers that could run a military and relied on the ability to recruit a citizens militia to fight any potential conflict very quickly should such a conflict arise. And that meant basically that the role of commander-in-chief for most of the time that the presidents were in office was not as big of a power as it was today. I should qualify that statement with one qualification, and that is, while there was no permanent Army and Navy in place in the United States until the end of the Second World War, there was one permanent military institution, and they're known as the Marines, or the Marine Corps. The function of the Marine Corps was essentially to protect American embassies. But that meant that there was at least a small military force that was permanently under the control of the president. And as consequently, the Marines that were involved extensively in various forms of foreign policy advancements of the United States throughout American history. Something we'll see in a bit more detail, especially when we consider this question regarding the declaration of war. It's Congress that declares war, not the president. Congress has declared war on 5 occasions throughout American history. The American military has been involved in foreign territory on average throughout American history on a basis of roughly slightly more than once a year. In other words, well over 300 various military deployments in various foreign countries, only 5 of which were ever authorized by Congress. The vast majority of those involved the Marines, and involved the Marines not in outright wars and invasions of foreign territory, although that occurred to a certain extent as well, but rather in taking over the customs houses of Caribbean countries or Central American countries or Latin American countries whenever they were unwilling or incapable of meeting their debt obligations. The U.S. would send in the Marines and force them to meet their debt obligations. One of the best examples of that was in 1903 in Venezuela. The government of Venezuela at the time had extensive debts to the British primarily, to a certain extent to the Germans as well, and seemed incapable of meeting those debt obligations. Whereupon the United States sent in the Marines to capture the custom house in Caracas and force them to pay off their debt obligations to Britain and France, pardon, Britain and Germany. Why would the Americans do that? Well, the answer to that is relatively simple. In 1823, they issued a pronouncement called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine declared that the United States would not tolerate any European power expanding its colonies in the Western Hemisphere or interfering in the Western Hemisphere. In other words, it declared itself a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. In 1823, that was merely an ambition, not something that they could actually make good at. But by 1903, essentially Teddy Roosevelt interpreted that as meaning that they had to do whatever was necessary to keep the Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. And if the Americans didn't force the Venezuelans to pay their debts, the British and the Germans surely would. And in that case, would send their troops in. And that would have been intolerable to the Americans, and therefore the Americans had to act first. In that regard, the Marines became extensively involved in what became known as gunboat diplomacy and various other types of military ventures in various parts of the world, which we'll discuss in much more detail as we move forward. Commander-in-Chief is probably one of the most important powers, and certainly one of the most important powers that we'll be looking at over the next couple of weeks. Aside from that, the President sends and receives ambassadors. Sends and receives ambassadors, and in the case of sending, with the advice and consent of the Senate. Meaning that any diplomat or any ambassador that is appointed by the President has to get approval from the Senate. The approval of the Senate in that regard is particularly important. Most diplomats ambassadors sent by the United States are political appointees, meaning essentially the President is rewarding individuals that have contributed to his campaign and so on by giving them a nice spot to rest for a couple of years in a foreign embassy somewhere. And the Senate is very rarely inclined toward throwing much in the way of the President's ability to do so. So, for example, Ronald Reagan sent an ambassador to Botswana, whose only qualification prior to being the ambassador to Botswana was that he headed the Boy Scouts of America. Certainly not something that gave him a great deal of foreign policy experience. But it was a political appointment. And the guy, of course, didn't speak the local language or anything of that sort. And this is a pattern that prevails in the United States to this day. So, for example, the current ambassador to Germany, sent to Germany by Donald Trump, doesn't speak a word of German. The Russian ambassador to Germany has been an ambassador to Germany for over 20 years. Speaks fluent German, speaks fluent French, speaks fluent English, speaks fluent Russian, of course. And in that sense, you have to wonder who is going to be more effective in an environment like Germany. Now, most Germans, especially most German politicians, speak fluent English. So not speaking German is probably not as big of a problem as one might imagine. But nonetheless, it doesn't send a very strong signal of concern with the situation there on the part of the United States. Let me remind myself. Sends and receives ambassadors. Okay. And finally, negotiates treaties. Again, with the advice and consent of the Senate. Let me briefly talk about what is meant by that. Congress, obviously, cannot negotiate treaties with foreign powers. The House of Representatives consists of 435 representatives. the Senate of 100 representatives, and for these institutions to be involved in the negotiations of agreements with foreign powers is obviously impossible. And consequently, it's the president that speaks with one voice for the United States, but the importance of treaties is such that he can't simply be left to his own devices in forming agreements with foreign powers, and therefore any treaty that he negotiates has to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. And that has enormously important implications for the United States. It also has enormously important implications for international politics. So for example, and I'll just cite a couple of examples in this regard, the Treaty of Rome that was signed in Rome in 1998 and brought into existence the International Criminal Court was negotiated on the part of the United States by the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration was accused at the time of trying to water down that treaty to make it as restrictive as possible to assure that Americans wouldn't be dragged in front of the International Criminal Court for various things. But nonetheless, he cooperated in that and signed the United States onto the treaty when it was agreed upon by the vast majority of the states in the international system. He did not, however, submit that treaty to the Senate. Anyone know why he didn't submit it to the Senate?
Because it would fail and the treaty would fall apart.
Basically because the Senate was dominated by Republicans in 1998. This was at the end of Clinton's term, right around the time of the Monica Lewinsky scandal and so on. In other words, his political capital in Washington was very low, and his chances of getting that treaty through the Senate were virtually zero. And consequently, Clinton, probably somewhat wisely, decided not to hand it to the Senate, because if the Senate rejected it, that would be the end of the treaty. Instead, he sat on it, probably with the hopes that Al Gore would be elected in 2000, which of course he was, but that's another story, and that Al Gore would have a more cooperative Senate and be able to get this treaty through under those circumstances. Al Gore did win the elections, but of course the elections were stolen by George W. Bush, and consequently Bush came into the White House, and Bush simply crossed Clinton's signature off of the treaty altogether. And not only that, but then pressured Congress to pass what became known as the American Service Member Protection Act, otherwise known as the Invade the Hague Act, in which he committed any future American government to do whatever was necessary to make sure that no American would ever come in front of the the International Criminal Court. And since the crimes that the International Criminal Court is responsible for adjudicating enjoy universal jurisdiction, meaning that any country on the planet can arrest somebody that they think is guilty of violating these rules, what could the Americans do if Dick Cheney was arrested in Germany and handed over to the International Criminal Court? Well, of course, they could invade the Hague. That's the location of the International Criminal Court. Hasn't come to that, but nonetheless, it's kind of interesting. Another good example of that same basic dynamic that has equally negative consequences is the Paris Treaty that was signed in 2015 around the issue of climate change. If you've been really paying attention, you'd say, wait a second, the Paris Agreement in 2015 was not a treaty. And there's only one reason why it wasn't a treaty. And that was because Barack Obama stated quite openly that he would never get the treaty through the Senate. And therefore, the entire agreement for their entire planet was negotiated as a non-binding agreement, not as a treaty. And the sole reason for that is because of American insistence that it be so. Otherwise, it would be a more enforceable treaty. And in that case, the Canadians also, of course, didn't shine in those negotiations. They didn't throw their weight behind the Americans in this regard, but certainly were very much favorably inclined toward that same basic watering down of the treaty to an agreement because the Canadians have been no better than the Americans in living up to their commitments to the Paris Agreement. And of course, many other countries have also reneged on that. I was going to go on to the third institution in the American constitutional system, and that is the judiciary. But we are now 20 minutes to the end of our time, the end of my welcome in this room. So let me instead see if there's any quick questions or comments about anything that I've covered thus far, and then we'll look at the judiciary next week.
As a concern, if we could vote,
basically, all it meant is that everyone still voted as one person per vote, but the votes from those states counted. Basically, if a voting district consisted of equal numbers of people in every riding or in every constituency that elects a member of the House of Representatives, those that had a large number of slaves had those slaves counted as 3/5 of a person, and that meant that the smaller number of whites that could vote had in effect a much more important vote than their counterparts in the North, where the number of slaves were smaller. In that regard, one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that there is the general perception that slavery was a matter of North and South. It is certainly true that the populations of the southern states consisted of far larger numbers of slaves. But it is not true that it was only the southern states that were involved in slavery. Indeed, the slave trade was concentrated in northern states, and in particular in ports like Provincetown, Rhode Island, New York, and so on and so forth. In that sense, all of the American Republic was tied rather heavily to slavery. And Gerald Horne wrote an interesting book in this regard, and that was published, I think, 2 years ago, called The Counter-Revolution of 1776, in which he argues, or in which he poses the basic question: how is it possible that these 13 colonies were able to cooperate with each other in battling against the British in 1776, and then come to blows less than 100 years later in the Civil War over the issue of slavery? And basically what he argues is that it was not so much the issue of taxation that drove the Americans towards severing their links with Great Britain. It was the fact that the British Parliament was in the 1770s discussing outlawing slavery. In other words, that the Revolutionary War was largely in defense of the institution of slavery, which was crucial to the southern states, but was also crucial in particular to the investors in northern states that financed these slave ships and so on and so forth. I don't know if that answers the question. Any other good questions? Yeah.
Yeah, you said that the Articles of Confederation failed due to like 2 reasons. So.
No. What I meant to say is that they failed as a result of crises that took place for 2 different reasons. One was the domestic instability of revolutionary forces challenging the dominant elites through legislatures like in New Jersey, where they were trying to get the repeal of debts for debtors, and the other being the more revolutionary variety that took place in Massachusetts, where there was an actual violent rebellion against the institutions. That was one of the reasons for the Articles of Confederation. The other was the crisis with regard to foreign policy, in particular that the British refused to interact with the federal government of the Confederate government of the United States, and insisted on negotiating directly with the states, on the claim that since the federal government wasn't able to enforce its decisions on the states, that it was useless to negotiate with them. And this was recognized by the elites within Great Britain, within the United States, as a kind of a strategy of divide and conquer. In other words, that you negotiate different deals with different states, sweetheart deals with one in order to split the states against each other in an attempt to reconquer the lost colonies. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Any other quick questions or comments? Expressions of outrage and disgust or anything like that? Okay, I'm glad to hear it. Thanks. Oh, one thing I wanted to briefly mention before I let you go. I got an email when I got back last week from one of you wanting to meet with me in my office. And I did not get that until I got back, so I wasn't in my office. So if you, on the day of our lecture, decided you wanted to meet up with me for whatever reason, just let me know at the end of the class, and we can either discuss things here, or if you want, we can walk back across the office and discuss things there. It's easier.
Oh, you didn't write it? Saturday? No, Mike.
I told you. Which one? You running? You running like this year?
I don't know, man. They always
Right now.
I don't need a dry. I don't need a dry. Again. I don't know why you don't.
Both of these and put them together. So therefore, we create a federal legislature, two legislative bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate, one based on the Virginia plan, one based on the New Jersey plan.
Oh, okay.
Okay? Now, why didn't you ask that at the end of class when I said, hey, anyone have any questions? If you have that question, chances are a lot of other people in the class have that question too, and you'd be doing other people a favor by asking questions at that time. I'm just figuring, I don't know where.
Thank you.
No, I know, but I was like, I just.